Good afternoon and welcome to Listening Well during the 2020 election, encountering ideological differences with empathy and intellectual humility. Today we're going to provide some approaches to how do you listen to those with whom you disagree. The Stavros Niarchos Paideia program serves as a hub for civic dialogue in undergraduate education at Penn. SNF Paideia collaborates with many campus entities to promote opportunities for students to develop the knowledge, skills, ethical frameworks, and experiences necessary to be informed, engaged, and effective community members and leaders in society. The SNF Paideia program encourages the free exchange of ideas, civil and robust discussion of divergent reviews, and student community wellness through SNF Paideia designated courses, a fellows program, and campus events. Today is an example of us partnering with other organizations on campus, and we are proud to be joined today by Andrew Arendt from the Fox Leadership and POURS program and Batsi Vizengubaya from Counseling and Psychological Services at Penn. Andrew, Batsi, and I, it's been delightful working with them, but the three of us have created this workshop together, and we are deeply grateful for their partnership and collaboration. I'd like to turn it over first to Andrew. Andrew.
Yeah, thank you so much, Leah. So I'm Andrew Arendt. I am the Director of Operations for the Fox Leadership Program and the Penn Program on Opinion Research and Election Studies, which we call POURS. And I just want to kind of lay out just a scene setter for today's discussion and today's workshop, kind of about a little bit about the 2020 elections, but also a little bit about public opinion polls and some of the polarization that we can kind of see through all of them. This is a lot of the work that we do through POURS on campus, where we teach students how to interpret and study and conduct really their own public opinion polls. And so the big thing to remember, particularly as we head into this election, and you see different polls that are out there, is that polls are very much a snapshot in time, right? So they are a reflection of the people that were interviewed and how they felt at the moment in which they were interviewed. And so at this moment where we are currently recording this session, there have been two debates that have taken place, right? The presidential debate and the vice presidential debate. About a week ago was when we all learned that the president was diagnosed with the coronavirus. And so all of these news events that kind of happen in the world impact the way that people feel about issues and see issues and then respond to questions when they get asked by pollsters. But often it will take a little bit of time for those feelings and opinions to appear in public opinion polls, because there's always a bit of a delay and a lag. And so one of the big things just to remember about public opinion polls is that it really depends on kind of when the poll was conducted as to what is the meaning of those results. And so everybody will put a lot of stock into the head-to-head. Trump is at this percentage and Biden is at this percentage. But just remember that it is a snapshot from when the poll was taken and is not necessarily indicative of what's going to happen on election night. And so, Kaylin, if we could just go to the next slide. My team at POURS has been partnering with our colleagues at NBC News and also at SurveyMonkey to be doing some tracking polling over the last couple months, basically since the pandemic hit. Back in February. And so we've been doing basically 6,700 interviews a day. So at this point, we're up to about 1.3 million interviews overall in our survey. And we've been asking very general questions, right, just to see, just to gauge, right, people's opinions about the election and also about the pandemic. And so the results that you see on the screen right now are the results of the percentage of people when asked if they were worried, if they were very worried, somewhat worried, not all that worried, or not worried at all about the coronavirus. This is the percentage of people that, expressed some worry about COVID-19. And we've split that out again across partisanship. And the real big point here, just to make this for you all, is that the polls actually provide us the ability to understand kind of the polarization that we are experiencing in our country, and that actually is very much the scene setter and the basis for the conversation that we're having today. Right, where even though, we all are kind of wrestling with the implications of COVID-19, we actually have differing opinions about how worried we are about all of it. You can kind of see towards the beginning of the pandemic When we first started in the field, there was no discernible difference, right, between Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And as we've kind of gotten later in the pandemic, you can start to see that the percentage of folks that are partisans that feel worried about COVID-19 actually starts to split off. You can see here in the middle, right around June, when we saw just a bit of an uptick, right, in the amount of worry that Republicans expressed, and it's been a kind of a cascade down for the Republican members ever since. But I should specify that this polling result that I'm sharing with you was taken before we learned that the president had the COVID-19 diagnosis. And so it's completely possible that when we get the latest batch of data, that this result would actually be slightly different. But the big point here is just to remember, right, that the polls provide us an insight into the polarization that we're all living with and kind of the foundation of the assumptions and beliefs that different people kind of have about kind of the world that we live in. Kaylin, we'll go to the next slide now and talk a little bit just about the economy. Right, this asks a very similar question, right, where it asks kind of looks at the percentage of people that are very worried, right, about the U.S. economy. And you can see generally, you know, throughout a good portion, the spring and kind of the early parts of the summer, Democrats and Republicans are pretty much kind of in line together. But as we've gotten kind of later towards this, to the point that we're in right now, which is in the fall of 2020, you can see kind of a difference between the percentage of Republicans that say they're very worried about the U.S. economy versus the percentage of Democrats. And so this becomes super important, right, as we start to engage in conversations about politics and really engaging in conversations about trying to do our best to listen, right, to where other folks are coming, to just come to the realization that we all don't necessarily make the same assumptions about the world. And so these snapshots provide us kind of a basis to try and get a sense of how our fellow Americans and fellow voters are kind of seeing the key issues of the day and are kind of seeing where we're headed and kind of how we've all personally been impacted by kind of the challenges that we are currently facing, both with the pandemic, with the challenges in the economy, and beyond. And so I just want to leave you with a few just kind of best practices when looking at polls. And Caitlin, if you could just go to the next slide. This is an infographic that our colleagues, my friends and colleagues over at NBC News have put together. And these are just questions that I think are really important that you ask yourself as you start engaging with public opinion data, right? The first one is just always asking yourself who conducted it. You'll often see polls that are conducted by media organizations or universities. Those are ones that you should probably trust more than ones that are maybe released by political campaigns, just because incentives aren't always aligned. Point number two is, how do the polls compare to other polls? As I kind of did with our trend line, right, it's actually really important to put those in context, and that a single poll is just simply a data point. But being able to see how it kind of averages with all of the other data points that are being measured becomes super important to be able to put things in context. Point number three, whether it's a national popular vote poll or not, there's a misconception about 2016 that the polls were off and that they didn't necessarily predict the winner. But often we're projecting meaning onto them that isn't actually there. So those national vote polls right before the 2016 election had Hillary Clinton about 2-3 points up over Donald Trump, and Hillary Clinton ended up winning the popular vote. And so just because we conduct elections by the Electoral College, and sometimes we measure people's opinions via a national vote poll, those things aren't necessarily aligned. And so just kind of putting our critical thinking caps on to figure out what is actually being measured in this poll, and how can we, what meaning can we derive from those poll results. Point number four is just, when was the poll conducted? I kind of made this point already, but becomes super important, to put it in context. Number five is, what was the sample size? Generally, larger sample sizes are better than smaller, just because it's going to have a smaller margin of error. Point number six becomes super important, right? Because you kind of need to keep in mind this margin of error, that polls are estimates, right? People try to put a lot of specificity onto the exact number or results that a poll provides. But the reality of the situation is that it's an estimate, and it can be a little bit lower or a little bit higher. And so just kind of remembering that the poll results shouldn't project a ton of specificity onto a poll result. Point number seven, particularly as we're getting ready and gearing up for an election, becomes super important as to exactly who is polled. You'll sometimes see polls of all adults or registered voters or likely voters. And those are three different populations, right? All adults can include anybody that's over the age of 18. Registered voters are specifically people that are registered to vote and are on a voting roll. And likely voters are voters who pollsters are kind of modeling the likelihood that they are going to vote in this election. It actually is really hard to do because you're attempting to model something that you don't know. You don't know who's going to show up and vote when November rolls around. And then last but not least is just how was the poll conducted. There are better methodologies and kind of worse methodologies that kind of lead to more precise or informative polls or maybe not. But knowing exactly whether it was, you know, a phone poll, whether they called cell phones and landlines, whether it was conducted online, whether it was sent via text messages to phones, becomes really important just to get a sense of how much meaning you should potentially put into those results. But all of this is just as a scene setter, right, to the conversation that we're going to engage in afterward, provides kind of the information to kind of think about as we're not only engaging with folks that think differently about politics from ourselves, right, but also engaging with how we're measuring all of this stuff as well. Because as you can see with some of the poll results that I've presented today, we have a large amount of polarization that exists in our country. And part of that is because we kind of see events and we see things just vastly differently from one another. And so with that, Leah, I'm going to pass it back over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrew, for sharing that wonderful context and information as we consider how to listen. Batsi, can I pass it to you?
Yeah, thanks, Leah. Yeah, thank you, Andrew. That was really helpful just to think about the full picture as we look at those polls, and then thinking about the role of listening as part of that. So again, hi, my name is Batsi. I'm the Director of Outreach and Prevention Services at CAPS, which is the counseling center on campus. And I just wanted to share some insights from a mental health perspective around, you know, the time that we're currently living through with this pandemic. So something that we're noticing, not just within the PEN community, but broadly speaking, is, you know, increased sense of anxiety, maybe some worries and uncertainty about the future. Also just really noticing rates of, you know, sadness, you know, depression, you know, increased worry about health, about the economy, about experiences of discrimination that certain populations are experiencing. So all of these things we know from a mental health perspective, there may be a lot of stressors that people are currently experiencing right now. And one of the things that I think the role that you can have in terms of thinking about listening and being there for each other is really thinking about how we all respond differently, and we all need to cope differently as a result. So in just reflecting a little bit on the data that Andrew shared, as you can see, like we can all have different opinions, and maybe even within some of the political beliefs that we each hold, we may all be responding differently to this time. And how do we communicate with each other in a way that allows us to honor some of those differences, but also promote a way of coping together as we notice some of those differences in how we may be feeling. With some of the mental health stressors that I mentioned, it's also important to recognize that some of these feelings are really normal, right? We've all been asked to adjust in pretty significant ways in response to the pandemic, and maybe even in response to the upcoming elections. But really recognizing that we may all need different things, and maybe some of the feelings we have may be normal. So maybe there may be feelings of anger or frustration or sadness, but just really recognizing that maybe we all need support in different ways, and just encouraging people to seek that support as needed, whether it's mental health support or other forms of support within the community. But just really recognizing that we may all be in different places and need different things in terms of what can help us feel better during this time. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Leah before I sort of share some of the qualifiers to listening.
Thank you very much, Batsi. Thank you so much for sharing. So what I want to do today, before we get into some qualifiers and talking about the list of what we are planning to do with this workshop, is I want to just introduce myself as well. I am the Student Advising and Wellness Coordinator and Advisor for the Padilla program, but I also am a political scientist. And as a political scientist, this period has been quite interesting, to say the least. So I began teaching in 2011, and I was teaching up until 2018. I was teaching Introduction to American Politics every semester. And what was so interesting is early on, back in 2011, many times my students, I'd have to wake them up. I'd have to say, today we're studying the Electoral College, wake up, because they'd be so sleepy. By the time we got to around 2015, I no longer had to say that. Instead, it was kind of like, go back to sleep, because they were so, for lack of a better word, agitated around certain ideas. And it was harder and harder in our classroom discussions for us to listen to each other. And so I started to worry about this and think carefully about how can we do politics in such a way, how can we even teach politics? How can we learn about American politics in a way that better integrates our understanding? How can we listen? And so this is a question that has intrigued me for a while, and that's why I'm so thrilled to be with Andrew and Botsi as we discuss this together. One other thing that I would also add from political science, there is a political scientist, he is no longer alive, Samuel Huntington. And not all of his scholarship I appreciate. To be honest, some of the stuff he wrote later in his life about civilization, I don't recommend. But what he wrote in 1981, he wrote a book called American Politics, The Promise of Disharmony. And in that book, he has a very important and famous quote. He says, there is an ever-present gap between American ideals and American institutions in practice. And certain periods in American history, people are awake to that gap. He calls them periods of creedal passion, when people realize that there is that gap and it needs to be closed. Other times are called creedal passivity moments, where people are not aware, they're asleep to the gap. And I think right now we're in one of those moments, those creedal passion moments, where there's a lot of emotion. And so the things we know cognitively and rationally about American politics are reckoning with our emotional feelings about things. And emotion sometimes is taking the day. And so what do we do with those emotions? How do we integrate them into how we think and how we rationally approach politics? That's kind of what we want to look at today. So Botsi is going to start us off with qualifiers to listening.
Yeah, so just following up on what Leah just shared, it's important that we know what those emotions are, right? Because maybe those are going to be part of what's guiding us as we have these conversations with other people. And a big part of that is knowing whether you have the emotional capacity to even be having these conversations. So maybe at times you're feeling really tired, maybe drained, maybe depleted, and maybe those are not the best times to actually try to have a difficult dialogue with somebody. So I think the first point is just making sure you're taking care of yourself, like recognizing what you have energy for and what you have capacity for. And if you can, identify what specific feeling you're having, like as part of what you're feeling shame, as part of what you're feeling guilt, as part of what you're feeling a lot of anger, and where could those emotions be coming from? And just really being thoughtful about that before you engage in these conversations. And then of course, thinking about those emotions during the conversation and even after. So finding ways to check in with yourself. So just really thinking about that. The second point that we want to emphasize is to really make sure you're mindful of your own boundaries. Again, sometimes maybe somebody's ready to have a conversation with you and you may not be in the space that you're ready to do that. So just really being thoughtful about defining those boundaries, because maybe you can recognize when maybe those boundaries are not being respected. And then of course, what do you need to do in order to reassert your boundaries in ways that feel comfortable for you, whether those are physical or emotional boundaries. Leah's going to share a little bit of some of the suggestions from the Alan Jacobs book.
Yes, thank you, Batsy. So Alan Jacobs is a scholar who's written a book called How to Think, a survival guide for a world at odds. And he has this checklist at the end of the book, and we'll return to some of the aspects of the checklist at the end of this conversation. But before you even get into a conversation with someone with whom you know you probably have some areas of disagreement, there are some things you want to be careful about, in addition to what Batsy just shared so well. You want to be careful to avoid people who fan the flames, that he says, people that intentionally try to stir up and agitate things. Maybe those aren't the people you want to practice these kinds of postures around listening that we're going to talk about. Maybe those are the people you want to leave for a kind of a quick, more speedy conversation, but not ones you want to listen to deeply. Also, these last two, which I think kind of fit together, gravitate towards people who value genuine community. In essence, those people who want to listen to you as well, who want to form community, who want to be in a relationship with you. And finally, when you're looking to talk to someone who holds views that you disagree with, seek out the best, fairest-minded people. Seek out those who will articulate positions that are different from yours, that will articulate them well, that have thought through their ideology, that know where they're standing. Those will be the best people to represent the kind of difference that you're seeking to learn about. So we're going to now move into the next slide. Oh, actually, excuse me, sorry. We're going to watch this video together. This is another kind of, before we even get into what we want to talk about, we want to share this video.
We've all been in arguments, and it wouldn't be an argument if you didn't believe that you were right and they were wrong. But aren't we all wrong sometimes? No one is right about all the things all the time. Research shows that admitting that we might be wrong can actually help us be better friends, happier people, and more effective advocates for our beliefs. This is called intellectual humility, and it's a gift. Not the kind you're born with, but the kind you can give yourself. So why don't we? Why is it so hard to admit that we might be wrong? In our minds, our ideas, assumptions, and experiences weave together to form our picture of the world. So you can see why it's painful to admit that something we believe in is wrong. One tug on the thread and it can feel like our whole sense of self is unraveling. In fact, studies show that our brains actually react to attacks on our beliefs the same way as threats to our physical well-being. Our natural human tendency is to avoid those threats, surround ourselves with people who think just like us. It doesn't matter how smart or well-educated you are, anyone can fall into these traps. But we can break out of these bubbles. Our ideas don't need to limit us. We just need to remember that some of the things we know are wrong or incomplete. It doesn't have to feel like a failure. It can feel like a relief. We can let go of the ideas that were holding us back from growth. This is one of the key features of intellectual humility, that willingness to accept and admit that you might be wrong. Early research shows that people who practice intellectual humility make more thoughtful decisions, have stronger connections with their friends and partners, and are more tolerant, which could lead to a happier life. We live in a time where there's pressure to appear like you're always right. But recognizing an incompleteness in our knowledge isn't weakness or ignorance. It's the opposite. It turns every day into an opportunity to learn and grow. In fact, people who practice intellectual humility are shown to be better at recognizing persuasive arguments. That means you could be a more effective advocate for your beliefs by allowing them to be challenged. The scientific method asks us to test every idea, question every theory, and that discipline is responsible for much of the explosive progress that has defined the last 2 centuries. Intellectual humility is the same principle applied to the individual, constantly refining your understanding of the world and yourself. The person you are now only exists because the person you were was willing to grow into something new. Intellectual humility is that willingness. It allows us to constantly search through our understanding of the world and bit by bit, make it better. Learn more about research on intellectual humility at
So we'd like to ask you to spend some time thinking about these questions before we start the next portion of our workshop. We'd like to think about you to think about why this time period is so hard for discussion. And what about the concept of intellectual humility spoke to you? So we're just going to take a few moments. Wonderful. So let's come back, and we want to introduce our framework for today. So this afternoon, we'd like to approach dialogue in 3 different postures, 3 different ways to go about thinking about dialogue. We want you to adopt certain postures for listening well before a dialogue, during a dialogue, and after the discussion. So that's how we've divided our discussion today, Batsi and I. So what do you do before? What's the posture before? I'd like to start with the first, metaphors matter. So when you're going into a dialogue, I'm offering 2 different ways of thinking about it. The first is a culture war metaphor. And when you think about war, I mean, just draw to mind the kinds of words that come to mind, free associate when you think of war. You are thinking about protecting yourself, you're thinking about anger, you're thinking about fear. War metaphors and conversations that are warlike are ones in which you are defensive, you're defending your own ideas, and then you launch on the offensive with your, sharpened arguments. You use them like spears towards the other person. Conversation around politics often adopts that metaphor, that mindset that we're at war. And so I either have to be afraid of you or very angry at you in order to talk to you. And really those 2 emotions, fear and anger, get in the way of real, genuine listening and actually real, genuine sharing as well. So I ask you to think about another metaphor, and that of a common table. Now, I'm Italian, and I love big tables, lots of food, lots of friends and family gathered around. And who doesn't, to be honest, who doesn't like being surrounded by friends and family and the smell of delicious food? And while you're passing that food around, were you laughing with your friends and family about certain things? What if that was the metaphor you thought about for political discussions, that kind of feeling? Then suddenly you're not my enemy. You're the person I'm passing the bread to. And I would love to talk to you about what I think. And I would really love even more so to listen to you. So again, that metaphor of a table where you literally set the table for another person. And sometimes in classes, I literally bring a place setting and a placemat, and I set the table to exemplify very slowly that metaphor. Because when you're setting the table for someone, when you're offering hospitality to someone, you put yourself second. You literally are thinking about, how can I do this? How can I lay that fork and put that plate and get that clean water for them in such a way that I can serve them? To be honest, the metaphor of table and service and hospitality, I think, is a good one for listening to others about any topic, but about politics and this moment in particular. Batsi?
Yeah, oh, thank you, Leah. I really appreciate thinking about those 2 metaphors. And if we were to go to the next slide, wanting to really expand on that, right? So part of the before posture is really thinking about setting our intentions, right? Or our expectations. So as Leah was mentioning, if we're thinking about this as a culture war, when you think about war too, part of what you're doing is sort of dehumanizing the other person, right? And if we're thinking about it from that perspective, it doesn't leave much room for us to find common ground or to find that common table and feel like we're serving the other person. At that moment, we're really sort of thinking about, how do we defend ourselves and our ideas? And as if you just listened to that last video, it can be painful for us to admit that we're wrong because it feels like it's threatening our sense of self. And that can be hard too, to feel like we want to be vulnerable with the other person. So part of what we want to share right now is thinking about how do you set your intentions for how the conversation is going to go, right? What are you hoping happens after the conversation? Are you hoping that, no matter what happens, this relationship can be over and you're willing to let go of that relationship? Or is your goal in that moment to really think about how do you learn about the other person's ideas and how do you convey your own ideas? Maybe that's part of what you're hoping for, is a real rich discussion on how to exchange ideas. And that feels more like you're setting the common table, right? It feels like you're trying to think about how to build a bridge between the two of you within that conversation, as opposed to maybe thinking that if you have this like really difficult dialogue, it may end in the two of you not talking anymore, right? But we also just want to be mindful that even as we're talking about setting intentions or expectations, you recognize that there are different topics that carry a different level of weight. So if you feel that somebody is saying things that are harmful in any way, or dehumanizing or discriminatory, right? That's not the type of conversation we are describing right now. We're not talking about somebody engaging in hate speech or violent speech, right? We're talking about somebody who's coming to the table and really wanting to engage in a meaningful dialogue, right? Because maybe you may set your intentions, but if they're not trying to meet you there, then of course that's not necessarily a healthy conversation to be engaged in. We also want you to be thoughtful about what your previous experiences have been, whether it's engaging with that person or engaging in these types of topics. Because for some of us, we've experienced previous traumas that may shape how we show up in conversation. So wanting to be thoughtful about that too, and setting your intentions, and again, being mindful of what you have capacity for based on whatever the conversation is that you're about to have regarding someone's political views or your own. We also just want to emphasize, just because you're setting your own intentions, it doesn't mean that you can control the other person's behavior, right? Part of what you can do is take accountability for yourself, take accountability for your own thoughts, your own feelings, and letting the other person have whatever reaction they have. And of course, again, going back to what we shared earlier, if you need to set some boundaries because the other person is now disrespecting some boundaries, then that's something that needs to be part of the conversation. But feeling anchored in your own intentions can be helpful so you don't lose sight of what you're hoping to do, especially if the conversation feels like it's going in a direction you don't want it to go in. You're able to sort of anchor yourself within your intentions for what you're hoping to get out of it. So for example, if you start to feel like a conversation is becoming maybe kind of toxic between you and the other person, maybe again, feeling anchored and saying, I want to make sure that I'm setting a common table with this person. I want to connect with them. That's my goal. So even as you start to argue, you can kind of come back to that same thing. Like, listen, I can see that we're disagreeing here, but my intention is that we leave this conversation still as friends, or we leave this conversation as family still, right? That I'm not looking to break our relationship over this conversation. So just really keeping that in mind as you set some of your expectations for the conversation. If we can go to the next slide.
Now, I so appreciate Batsi. I mean, whenever we talk, I learn so much, and I really appreciate how she was describing setting intentions as a grounding, because I think that whole setting of intentions and being intentional about conversations will hold you and keep you when you're in the conversation. And so we're moving now into during postures. So you've done this intentional thinking, you've thought about your metaphors, you've set your intention, now you're in the conversation. And one thing, Batsi gave all sorts of really good things to remind yourself in the middle of it, like if you need to even articulate your intention again, if something gets intense in the middle. But another thing you can articulate, or along those same lines, is this word aware. And even if you can't remember all of it, I was even thinking if you just could say aware in your head, just make sure that you don't let the conversation take on a life of its own and you lose yourself in it. And this idea of aware is something that I've just been thinking a lot about, and just an acronym here. Aware, first, acknowledge your own feelings, and throughout the conversation, check in with yourself. Note your self-talk, note the other person, note how you feel. and just be aware of yourself, acknowledge your own feelings. The other thing is wait. Listen holistically, whole body listening. And sometimes that literally just means counting a few beats, counting to 5. Just wait, let them talk. Just take a minute. And when you're waiting, watch your preconceptions. Watch, again, this might just be my tendency, but to read into and what's going to come next. Watch those preconceptions. And along those lines, anticipate your response and their response as best you can. While not being a preconception, this is more kind of anticipate the thing you're going to do or the thing you're going to say. And again, people you're closer to, you may have more anticipatory power, but yourself, you may know certain topics and subjects that are really going to be hard for you, really going to need an extra beat with. So try to anticipate those topics coming up so you're not so thrown by them. And then finally, this is one of my favorite, respirate, breathe. Take time. I often forget breathing, but just intentionally breathe throughout your conversation. Remember, you can care for yourself. Kind of the easiest way you can care for yourself is breathing. So just remember to breathe, respect their point of view, and reflect back to them what you're hearing. We're not always perfectly able to hear people sometimes because we've heard something the wrong way. So take the time to ask, wait, I'm hearing you say this. Is that what you're saying? Because I could be misinterpreting that. So just that very easygoing reflecting back. And then finally, educate. Listen to what they're saying. Listen to words, phrases, explanations, perhaps the data or sources they're using, so that you can learn more for your next conversation. You want to hear kind of their reasoning, and you want to know. You might not ever have heard of that source. Maybe you want to check it out. Maybe you want to read about that source if the actual source is not something you like. But educate yourself. Use the conversation as an opportunity for you to learn more. Next slide.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Leah, for those tips. We want to add one more tip, which is empathy, right? What is the role of empathy during the conversation, right? So we're going to play a short video for you. It is by Brene Brown, and she is trained as a social worker and a researcher and provides some insights on some of the components for empathy. So we're going to go ahead and watch that video.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Yeah, thank you so much for playing that video. So I've watched this video multiple times and I feel like it's always such a good reminder, right? Going back to what Leah was sharing earlier, you know, there's almost no empathy in a culture war, right? Empathy sort of resides at the common table, right? So part of what we really want to think about is how do we cultivate our empathy? So if we go to the next slide, just to summarize some of the things that you heard in that video, you know, empathy is a choice. And I think there's something that feels so empowering about that, to know that this is a skill that we can learn, right? We can choose to be empathic. We can choose to be vulnerable with somebody else. And in some of these conversations, that's what can actually lead to connection, even if we're disagreeing about something, right? If you can connect with that feeling in the other person. For instance, if you recognize that the other person is suffering in that moment based on what they believe is happening due to the political climate that we're currently in, that allows you to also connect with your own suffering around maybe some of the ways that you felt, right? So really being able to think about how can you use empathy as a way of finding connection and allowing there to be some vulnerability, right? And again, if we're thinking about a war, right, vulnerability is not necessarily a good thing, right? So again, thinking about the common table, vulnerability allows you to actually be able to open up a little bit, but maybe also allow the other person to be vulnerable and again, share a connection. So the 4 components that were shared in the video, again, just to reiterate those, are perspective taking, right? So really trying to find common ground or sort of understand where the other person is coming from, even if you don't agree with it and even if you're not trying to validate it, right? Part of what you're trying to do is just understand where they're coming from. Again, staying out of judgment. And again, it's so true. Like I work as a therapist and I have to work on this constantly, right? There's so many things where you may not do something the same way as somebody else, or maybe you don't even believe the same thing somebody does. But just trying to really be mindful when you're slipping into a judgmental place, because that's something that can continue to create distance between you and the other person. And then the last 2 points, recognizing emotion and communicating it. So if you are noticing that maybe something you've said has led to somebody maybe shutting down or seeming anxious or seeming frustrated, maybe again, as Leah was saying, clarifying that. Like I noticed that maybe you seem frustrated by what I said. Is that right? And can you let me know maybe what it is that's leading to you feeling frustrated? And being able to really sort of work through some of those emotions, as that can be the cornerstone of having really difficult dialogues and cultivating your sense of empathy. If you can go to the next slide, please.
And just as Batsy said, the goal of this conversation is connection. You want to connect and stay connected. And I really appreciate, again, everything Batsy ever says, but especially what she said about connection and that recognizing emotion is not condemning it or judging it, right? It's just continuing it. And so the conversation has ended. And these are some after postures. So again, we want to return to Alan Jacobs, the Thinking Person's Checklist. And again, sometimes you can evaluate a conversation you've just had by looking through a checklist. And I think his checklist is a helpful one for that reason. And so some of these here we've read already, so I'll go over just a few of them. But we hopefully will provide you a PDF or a document with this video so you can look at all of it, or also look at, of course, his book. But, you know, give some time to very provocative statements. And you may, you know, as you look back over a conversation you just had, evaluate, you know, some things you could have done differently and how you could have given something 5 minutes. Value learning over debating, kind of what we were saying with educating, don't talk for victory, which is a phrase he uses throughout the book. So find a way to learn. And again, as you're evaluating the conversation you just had, you can ask yourself, was I talking for victory? Was I valuing learning? These are things you can do. Avoid people, as we said before, who fan the flame. Remember, you don't have to respond to what everyone else is responding to signal virtue or right-mindedness. So in a conversation with another person, you do not have to signal certain things. You know, people aren't watching. It's just between you and the conversation. And these other things, I'm just going to skip to the last one about being brave. Conversations are hard, and especially Brene Brown asks you, and Batsy asks you to be vulnerable. And being vulnerable is really hard, especially when the stuff all around us is in culture war mode. So, you know, cable news and social media, there's a lot of war around, a lot of fear and anger. So it's extra hard to be vulnerable. So we're asking you to be brave. And even when you're looking back over a conversation you've already had, be brave. Like, go back into it in ways, and you know, if something traumatic happens, you know, wait a beat and talk to another person about it, of course. But if you can, be brave and look back and be honest with yourself about how you could improve for the next conversation. So Batsy, I'm going to turn it to you.
Great, thanks, Leah. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I love most about being a therapist is that you really get to connect with people in such meaningful ways. And I think whether it's been my own therapy or sitting with somebody as well as they're going through their therapy process, something that we often like to emphasize is that the change is not going to happen in the hour that we're sitting together, right? A lot of the change happens outside, right, when you leave. So part of what we want to encourage as you're listening to this presentation is really being mindful and thinking about the things that you do want to change. Like, what do you want to practice? So if you're watching this with somebody else, really thinking about what skills you want to put into practice so that you can you kind of test them out a little bit, similar to what you do in therapy, like kind of test it out with somebody else. And then once you leave that space, being able to take some of those skills with you and sort of use them and apply them and see what feels comfortable to you, see what works for you, and just really recognizing that you know, this is kind of part of the time to explore some of those feelings, to see what comes up for you as you have these difficult conversations. And then really think about what do you want to take back, especially as you're having difficult conversations with others. So again, reflect on what you want to practice and apply. And if we go to the next slide, we're just gonna again, give you a second to reflect on these two prompts. So we're going to pause again. But the first prompt is, what feels like a next step for you based on what you heard today? And the second question is, pick just one thing you're going to try to do to apply, maybe one posture, one concept, and explain why, right? So again, we're just going to give you a second just to reflect on those two questions before we wrap up today. So hopefully you'll take a little more time to reflect. But if we go to the next slide, we're just wanting to share some concluding thoughts today with all of you. So hopefully this was helpful in just thinking about how to have a conversation, especially during these times. And I know when Leah and I have met and talked about this presentation, we've laughed about the times that we've slipped up, right? Like, we completely got hijacked by emotions or just did not do a good job of listening, right? So this is definitely a skill that we all need to work on and continue to cultivate. And for each of you, maybe that's going to be true, that you're going to misstep at times, but just really able to think about, you know, what went wrong and how do you continue to move forward as we prepare, not just before the elections, but during and after the elections as well. And one last thing I wanted to add is, you know, there's so much going on right now between the pandemic, racial injustice, as well as other forms of discrimination and injustice. And there's so many stressors that we're all currently under right now. Because for all of us, we probably didn't think that we'd be experiencing this at this point in our lives. So just wanting to acknowledge that in some ways we're all suffering, and in very different ways, right? And part of what we're really hoping for with this workshop is that part of listening can help us think about how do we heal, but heal as part of a community, right? So not necessarily healing in isolation or suffering in isolation, but really thinking about how do I take my suffering in a way that allows me to heal in community with other people, to really think about how I can connect with other people during this time, especially at a time where maybe we're all experiencing some distress. So hopefully this was helpful. I'm going to turn it back over to Leah.
Botsi, thank you so much. The interconnectedness that Botsi was talking about is something we just want to end with, that it can feel all the way Botsi described the moment we're in right now. It's very challenging, and especially with the pandemic, it can feel isolating. Everything happening with racial awareness, it can feel isolating, but reach out and connect to people, and do so without fear, with these skills, but also with the sense that there are people who are cheering for you and really want you to connect to others and be in community. We're stronger together is kind of one of the things that we want to emphasize through this workshop. And it seems some of the problems seem intractable. That's something we can share. We can share that feeling that it seems intractable, these problems. They're only going to be solved together. So we would just like to close by saying thank you. I am so deeply grateful to our partners. Botsi, it's been such a pleasure working with you, and it was such a pleasure working with Andrew as well. But we created this and we met several times, and part of the wonderful process I'm taking away. It's been such a wonderful process. So we hope that we can offer to you this workshop, that it is helpful to you in a small part as how helpful it's been for me to work with Botsi. So thank you, and please join us again. Thank you again for listening today.